Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of this show is African-Centered Scholars, Intellectual Warriors. And I have reference to the work of the late, great Jacob H. Carruthers, for whom this Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies is named, of Northeastern Illinois University. And I have with me a professor from that institution who, like myself, was also a student of the late, great Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers. Josef Ben Levi. May I call you Dr. Josef Ben Levi?
Yes, ma'am, you sure can.
All right, Dr. Josef Ben Levi. I just want to say a couple of things about this paper that I am so much enjoying, called The Intellectual Warfare of Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers and the Battle for Ancient Nubia as a Foundational Paradigm in Africana Studies, Thoughts and Reflections. I looked at the abstract and I said, well, this sums up the call to arms. This sums it up because Dr. Carruthers refers to, and so do you, intellectual armies that are out here battling for the African mind, for the mind of black people. There are actually scholars whose avowed commitment is to seize control of the African mind. And so you are urging us to become a soldier in that battle.
Yes.
Which is why I'm calling you an intellectual warrior. And of course we need more intellectual warriors. See, they are Goliath and you are our David. And we need more Davids. But the thing that you mentioned is that we have so many intellectuals who are out here groping in the whiteness without tools. And you're a warrior, and there probably are some other people who think that they are a warrior, but if they don't have the right tools, then they won't be effective in the warfare. So I want you to talk about your paper and your work, and congratulations. I'm just so proud of you, but you know, you've been that all the time. So they're just recognizing it.
Thank you. Well, the article I wrote in the recent issue of the Journal of Pan-African Studies, was published in there at least, actually started out as a speech that I gave as a keynote address at the for the
Council.
The Chicago Council of Black Studies. And every year in February they give they have a program honoring Dr. Jacob Carruthers, usually on his birthday, which is around February 14th. And this year I was invited to be the keynote speaker. So my paper that was published is actually the speech that I gave. And I thought about a lot about what to say, and it dawned on me that this is a chance for me to not only talk about my relationship to Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers, but what it was about my relationship with him that inspired me to go in a particular direction. You know, I'm dealing with a lot of different things, but in something I've been passionate about for a very, very long time. And so I consider myself to be one of those intellectual warriors. I've been out here, I like to think, on the battlefield for a long time, engaged in this intellectual warfare, not only with the problem of European scholars who are addressing the question of ancient Kemet or the Nile Valley civilizations and ancient Kush or Nubia, but also with the blacks who challenge us in this regard. And Dr. Carruthers speaks to the fact that we're fighting a battle on two fronts. Not only are we fighting a battle with the European intellectual scholars, we're also fighting a battle with those, you know, black scholars or so-called African scholars who are in their camp supporting them in their argument against what the work that we were doing, and usually they'll put them in the forefront. And there's been a lot of them, in fact, writing lots of books and articles attacking the work that we do, and also trying to put us within one big boat. It reminds me so much of the early days of caricature, when they when terms like Sambo and in Great Britain, the Gollywogs, and in the Netherlands they had Black Peter, and they placed all blacks into those one boats, failing to realize that we're not monolithic, that there are different views. There have always been the views of the integrationists versus the nationalists. This has been a battle that's been going on since, as far back as the 18th century even. And you've had thinkers on both sides of that fence. However, the only ones we've basically been given are the integrationist view, straight up through Brown 1 and Brown 2. Brown versus the Board of Education, Brown 1, they dealt with, and then Brown 2, which had to do with something called entrance convergence. But my view as an intellectual warrior in this is to make the case that if you want to engage in this intellectual warfare, you need to be fully armed. You can't argue your case if you do not have key requisite tools. You need to have what Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop referred to as what he called the three factors: the historical, the psychological, and the linguistic factors. Mm-hmm. Those are very important. Mm-hmm. You got to know the history. Mm-hmm. You have to understand the history in its full scope, not just in a narrow perspective. If we're going to study the history of the Nile Valley, we got to not only study, the glory of the pharaohs and what they did, but we got to know what the common people did. We got to know their relationship to people on both sides of the Nile, in the Sahara, where there was a migration to the Nile, from the eastern desert, where there was a migration to the Nile, and from what they call the south, where there was a migration up to. We need to know all of that. We need to know the language that they spoke, or at least the language that they wrote in, so that we can understand how to translate the literature for ourselves, so that we do not have to rely on, and this is exactly what Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop told Dr. Carruthers when he went on sabbatical to meet with him back in about 1975, 74, 75, when he went over there, and he told him, the first thing you need to do is you need to go back and learn ancient Egyptian language. You need to learn Medu Neter, as it's called, divine speech, because we need to be able to look at the monuments, to look at the text and translate them for ourselves, and not rely on the translations of the Europeans who are doing translation, because oftentimes their translations are wrong. And it's fascinating that they're wrong. Oftentimes the hieroglyphs that we see are translations from what is called hieratic, which is a kind of script form of it. And they translated the hieratic into hieroglyphs, and sometimes they didn't get the hieratic right, and so they did the best they could with the translation of the glyphs. And now what we're doing is going back and reassessing a lot of that. But you can only do that if you know the script, if you know the writing. The same thing is true of in what they call ancient Nubia, where they had what they call the Meroitic language. Meroe and Napata were the two key states or cities that existed in that part of the Nile Valley. Now, one of the things that people fail to realize is that when the Greeks and the Romans show up in history, when they show up in history, we're talking about Athens coming up in the 5th century BCE, the civilization that is functioning in the Nile Valley is that of the ancient Cushites. That's what they see. Their interaction with Petronius and the Candaces and stuff that existed in ancient Nubia. These are the people that, for them, these are the Egyptians. All right, so, and they wrote in a particular script. Now, a long time ago, and as I talk about in my paper, how I actually got started in that, when in 1977, as a part of a huge task I'm working, you were around back then, so all the work we were doing, trying to learn the glyphs and doing all this research on the temples and the tombs and the monuments to prepare for this large group to go over and do this kind of field study research. Well, when we went to the Sudan and to Khartoum, which is where I was really interested because I wanted to see this stuff about Merowe and the Pata. I've been doing a lot of reading, trying to learn the script and so forth. So when I got an opportunity after one of the lectures that we attended by a professor by the name of Dr. Yusuf Fadl Hassan at the University of Khartoum, who specialized in ancient Merowe, to go to the museum. This is the National Museum of the Sudan. It has two huge statues of Taharka outside of it. And so I asked him if I could go over. The museum was closed. He made a phone call. I went over, beat on those big iron doors. Somebody came down, let me in. They let me see everything I wanted to see, go anywhere I wanted to go in the archives, everything. So, and as I point out in the paper, that was one of the thrills of my life. But also, it gave me a chance to really get serious about the study of the Meroitic language. Well, about maybe 4 years ago now, a group of people in Boston who have an organization called the Société Numismatique Histoire, all right, which is a numismatic society. They study ancient coins. Well, there was a cache of ancient coins that had been found back in 1856. And some of these coins were written on some of these coins, which are called tetradrachms. The tetradrachms are what they call owl coins. These owl coins have images on them. One side of the image has the image of Athena. The other side has an owl on it, so they're commonly called owl coins. Well, they were the currency of the ancient world at that time. And now, no matter what language was written on the coins, as long as it had that owl and the symbol of Athena on it, it was, currency in the world. Well, on the side where they have the owl, they also have or rather where they have Athena, they also have two other key little things. One is an olive branch, because olive oil was the key export from Athens at that time, and a half moon representing the Battle of Marathon that took place. Now, the script on it, they have been for years saying that they didn't know what the script was. They said it was a lot of things. They said it was ancient Aramaic. I knew it was ancient Aramaic because I know ancient Aramaic. But they said they didn't know what it was. So, these guys at this organization in Boston, who are white guys, sought out a Meroitic study scholar, and they found me. And they emailed me, and we communicated back and forth, and they eventually sent the coins to me. Sent copies of the coins to me.
Was this the coins that you showed at the ASCAC conference?
Yes, when I did the decipherment of the coin.
Right.
Yes, that's exactly it, all right? So this is the backstory.
All right.
All right, and so one of the guys said he had been in the Sudan in 1977 and saw a script that looked like that, and to him it looked like Meroitic. And so when I looked at it, I was like, well, it is Meroitic. Now the question is, how do we decipher it? Can we decipher it? So I do have some books and stuff on the script at home, and I told him I would give it a shot. What was interesting is that in the process of finally translating the information that was on the coin, not only did I realize that there are a few things that were there. One, the term Kush was on there in Meroitic. Next, there was a name. The name was Siapiqua. Now, what was interesting about Siapiqua is that most of the white Nubian people who study Nubia, or Nubianologists, believe Siapiqua to be a man. Well, there was a problem with that, because under Siapiqua was the term Kandake, which means Candace, which was like a female pharaoh at the time. So now we know that, first off, Siapiqua is not a man. Siapiqua was a woman. She was a royal woman. It was a Kandake, and that's only natural, because you find that a lot of coins are produced during the reigns of certain people. Right now, but also it says a lot. It also says, for one, they knew how to mint their own coinage, which meant that they knew something about commerce and were doing business with other peoples in other lands. All right, so in last year at the British Museum, they had a Nubian Studies conference. And so I submitted my proposal to present on the findings and my translation. Well, there's a guy in Geneva by the name of Claude Reilly. Claude Reilly is viewed as the authority on Meroitic. in the world. I don't care. I did a translation they said that nobody could do. He couldn't figure it out. So when I submit my paper, I get a response back from the British Museum and the Meroitic and the Nubian Studies Society that says that Claude really feels that that's not correct. And I'm like, how does he know it's not correct when he hasn't even seen what I did? So you're just going to assume me as an African-centered scholar in the United States, and I'm incapable of doing this translation? Well, my position was damn him, because my position and my translation stands. And now when I submitted to the Society Historia, Numismatica Histoire, they write a whole thing up about it. Do a whole editorial on the fact that I translated it and the translation and what it meant and everything. So, but my point is that that's what we mean by engaging in intellectual warfare. Mm-hmm. That there are people out there, by the mere fact that, no, I didn't study Meroitic under you, I taught myself. Mm-hmm. And it took me a long time, but I taught myself. You know, the fact that I learned it that way and I didn't study it under you does not give you the authority to assume that therefore I don't know. Mm-hmm. Because I don't have a stamp of European authority on me. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not looking for the stamp of European authority. That's one of the things that we have to get out. This is why it's very important that we engage in this research for ourselves. And that's what I do. I'm very much into the language. Anybody who knows me and the work that I do, I'm very much into language. I know Arabic and I do Hebrew and Aramaic and all this stuff. And I've been doing that for a long time. And I stand on that with anybody. And I'm not afraid to deal with these types of challenges and stuff like that occur. But I don't have a problem with not being accepted by, the Meroitic Studies or the Nubian Studies or the Sudanese Studies Association. I'm a member of ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, which we formed so that we could address ourselves and speak to our own researching issues. Some stuff that they don't want to accept, but we understand that, but they know who we are. They know what we do. But we're not concerned about getting their approval. We don't need their approval.
You don't need their validation.
We don't need their validation. That's part of one of the problems that we have. A lot of other black scholars out there who are attacking us and attacking African-centered scholarship or Afrocentric. And I point out to them, there's a difference. I was on the African History Network just this past Thursday night, and the guy came on and he was talking, and he was very critical of Afrocentric, and I let him know, I'm not an Afrocentrist. I am African-centered, and there is a difference.
Absolutely. Afro is a hairstyle.
Right, I told him, we're talking about a philosophical perspective that involves only the culture and the history and the politics and the social. We also talking about pedagogy, and we're talking about curriculum too here. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a broad-based thing that involves looking at the whole world of African people. When we speak about African-centeredness, we're talking about, yes, starting out in the Nile Valley, which is fundamental because as far as we're concerned, the relationship of the Nile Valley to the rest of Africa is the same as the relationship between Greece and Rome to the rest of Europe. Now, all of Europe identifies Greece and Rome as the foundations of their civilization, even though genetically and otherwise they are not even related to the Greeks or the Romans whatsoever. We can make the argument that there is a relationship, a cultural unity between what's happening in the Nile Valley and what happens in the rest of Africa. Now, those black scholars, and even some of the whites, but especially the black scholars who argue against it, say, well, we're talking crazy. Well, obviously, and they will even critique or criticize those in the 19th century, like Edward Wilmot Blythe or Martin R. Delaney or William Wells Brown or James McCune Smith. I could go on and on. William Scarborough. There were a bunch of, there were people like Eliza Pendleton, who wrote a textbook back in the 19th century that dealt with Kush. There are people like Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins. Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins' book deals with ancient Kush. These are people who were writing back then. Maria Stewart, who spoke up after they killed David Walker, who spoke about the importance in this relationship between African people and ancient Egypt, and the fact that, the label African was very important. Most of the people that I've read that critiqued us have never even spent the time to study how it was that we moved from being called Africans in this country to being called coloreds and so forth and so on. Never even as I research them and I look at them, I say to myself, they haven't even read the materials. They don't even see the relationship between the challenge that African people had in this country when the American Colonization Society was advocating going back to Africa. Many of them said, well, we're not going back to Africa. We were born here, because they were representative. Most of them who were involved at the time were Africans who had been born in America. You know, another term for that within the confines of the state of Louisiana is the term Crayola, right? You know, there's a whole misconception about Creole. Creole basically were the Africans who were born here in the United States. They were the first generation born here in the United States. And many of them, including in Louisiana, they knew they used to be called Senegalese, because many of them came from Saint-Domingue, all right, from the French territories in the Caribbean, and many of them came from what came to be known as French West Africa, which included places like Senegal. So, you know, to engage in this battle that we're talking about, and that's just one example there. You know, other examples include, and by the way, in terms of the Meroitic script, you know, I've been sent other things from monuments there that people said, could you tell me what that says? And I'm going to work on that and let them know what it says. You know, I don't have a problem with that. But we have to have our own scholars to validate ourselves. We don't need them to do this for us, or to defend their case for them, because they could defend their cases for themselves pretty good. An example I give in the paper is a book called Wretched Kush by a guy by the name of Tyson Smith. Wretched Kush, the very term wretched.
Right. That's an oxymoron.
Ooh, wretched. I mean, that's like, you know, that implies the baseness of yourself as a person as far as it can go. And so I make the case when I argue with him, because he can see it, it's right there, it's published. My position was, you know, when he talks about the description of blacks with the thick lips and the broad nose, I'm like, this is the very same type of anthropological crap that was created in the 19th century when they developed the field of anthropology out of naturalism, and they were using that description to justify what they caricature a black person to look like, even though in many of these places there were many Moors, you know, just another term that means black. There were many Moors, and they had a lot of respect for the Moors. And in fact, having a Moor in the royalty of Europe in a family was something that was considered like prestigious, you know. But I pointed out by showing that, hey, here's some tombs where there are monuments and stuff on the walls, iconography, that clearly show that this man doesn't know what he's talking about. You know, from the tomb of Ramesses III, the tomb of Ramesses II. Now, you know, they don't even allow people to really go in a lot of tombs now. We used to be able to go into, they don't allow them to, you can't even go up in the pyramids now. You can take a picture in front of it, but you can't go up in there now. Now, my thing is, why all of a sudden are they doing this? And the Supreme, the guy who's in charge of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in what they call Egypt, what we call Egypt, see, they call it the UAR, the United Arab Republic. See, that's just, you know, Egypt is good because Egypt makes a lot of money. All right, and the fact that you know, he has made the case that, well, the ancient Egyptians were not Africans. You know, they look just like us here. And of course, my argument with them is this: of course, you would say that, being a descendant of the Arabs who didn't get there until 639 of the Common Era, of course you would say something like that, because for you, that's not your people. You know, these are some other people. Now tell me, if they was really your people, why would they decide to build a dam, you know, to create a lake, the Aswan High Dam, to create what they call Lake Nasser at the time, to destroy literally thousands of years of Nubian history that's under that water? They're doing the same thing at the Fourth Cataract. At the Fourth Cataract right now today, they are in the process of building a brand new dam. They are displacing thousands of Nubians who live down there, and at the same time, they're going to destroy thousands of years of civilization. But I point out in my paper that if anybody understands the history of Islam and Islamic thinking, you know, they have a term called jahaliyat in Arabic, which means ignorance. And during the age of ignorance, they see as the time before the Hijrah, which took place in 622 when Muhammad makes his flight from Mecca to Medina. Anything before that time in traditional Islam, I'm talking about. Because sometimes when I say Islam, people think of the Nation of Islam, and I ain't talking about that. You know, because that's our orientation. We don't really see the world in a broader context. But before that time, as far as they're concerned, anything that happened before then is not historical. This is why right now today in the city of Timbuktu in Mali, you got these fanatic Islamists they're literally destroying Timbuktu over there. This is a great city, but because of its the tombs of the Sufis, who are kind of a metaphysical form of Islam that is practiced, very, very, very spiritual, very different from the type of Islam that they're pushing over there. And this is not a new thing. This has happened before. They want to destroy all of that. And my fear is that all of the work that has been done over there, the archive, all of those textbooks that they have from the University of Sankore, because they have nothing to do with what they're thinking of as Islam, that they're going to destroy and burn them all. Because they burned them up, they burned books before, and I can see them doing this all over again. And so, when we're engaging in this whole idea about of intellectual warfare, this is why I talk about we need armies of people. We need not just people who do the archaeology, do the anthropology, or do the epigraphy, doing with the language. We need people who are botanists. We need people who are physicists. You know, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, that was his specialty. He was a physicist, a nuclear physicist, among other things. We need people who have all of the necessary skills for us to do this work, and we need to be training people to think about the importance of being engaged in this work, because slowly, our history is being taken away from us. And here in the United States, we can see it real clear, because, for example, in Texas, that's where they do a lot of textbooks. And in Texas, they are about the business of rewriting the history of the United States, to the extent that they're going to make the whole experience of slavery in the United States to be a very benign, kind of benevolent kind of thing, that it wasn't so bad for them. Well, if they tell that story 10 years from now, the generation of children who are learning that story will think that it's not so bad. And that way, they can go about perpetuating a little kind of clever thing that's going on in the political discourse right now. In the political discourse right now, they're slowly figuring out ways to change the story. For example, when they talk about voter suppression, what's the difference between voter suppression and having the poll taxes and stuff that they used to do before? It's the exact same thing. They just changed the name of it, because their thing now is because during Reconstruction, a lot of blacks voted. And then they turned around and changed all of that when they ended Reconstruction and prevented blacks from having the right to vote. And that right to vote didn't show up until 1964, when they signed the Voting Rights Act, which is under the Commerce Clause, which is very interesting. And so they're trying to do that all over again. So we need so many people to do this battle on all these different fronts. And the importance of ancient Kush in this is very crucial, because ancient Kush as a part of African civilization is virtually unknown to our people. We don't know about, the fact, they will refer to ancient Kush as the place where you had the black pharaohs, as if all of the pharaohs weren't black. They say, well, in other words, they have carved out a piece of Nile Valley civilization and said, we'll give you this, because we can't deny this, because that's in what we call Africa. Because see, you got to remember that Egypt is not a part of Africa. Egypt is a part of a place they call the Middle East, which didn't come into existence until 1900, the very term. All right? So now we're arguing that all of it belongs. Now, there are those who argue there was no Africa in ancient times. You're absolutely correct. It used to be a province. And I'm not taking anything away from that. But right now, that is the continent of Africa, unlike Sarah Palin, who doesn't know the difference between a country and a continent, And those people who are from that continent are descendants of that continent. And in the United States, like I said, up until the time of the American Colonization Society, and their argument, because most people fail to realize that the abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, and all them nice people, they were not interested in ending slavery. They were interested in getting free blacks out of the United States. And if they could send them back to Africa, that was good, because they did not want the influence of the free blacks on the enslaved blacks to make them aware of things, especially after stuff like the Haitian Revolution had occurred. They were terrified, because one of the things that all slave owners had to be concerned about every night was an insurrection on the plantation and being killed. And of course, after Nat Turner, everybody was in a state of paranoia, right? So they were concerned about that. So there were many blacks during this time after the American Colonization Society that began to write about, well, you know, while yes, we are Africans, we are descendants of Africa and so forth, but we were born here, we're gonna fight here. You know, a lot of our people built this thing, made it possible. We want to make it happen. But at the same time that they are making this case, you know, and this is in some cases, you know, you got two battles. You got the nationalists, you know, you got people like Henry Highland Garnett and Martin Robertson Delaney, right? Mm-hmm. And them who are saying, you know what, these people ain't gonna never be right with us. They ain't gonna never treat us right. We need to get out of here and go back and build our own thing. But then you had other groups, you know, even people like Alexander Crummell, who was the founder of the American Negro Academy. They exist between roughly 1890 and 1923, which was the first black think tank in the United States, who was arguing that, hey, we're here, let's fight our case here. All right. Even Du Bois thought that early on in his existence. So, and as time was going on, this group of blacks was saying, you know what? We don't want to have anything to do with Africa. We don't even want to be related to Africa. And so as time goes on, we see this change in the name, you know, and even though there are questions with, you know, there are issues, you know, with the naming. You know, Alexander Crummell was like, you know, hey, let's get over trying to be called Africans or Negroes or Afro-Americans or anything like that, and get on with trying to get our act together over here. That was one of his arguments. But there were others who were saying, but we don't want to have that name. We're coloreds, you know. While they despise being called, you know, Negroes and so forth, they said we want to be coloreds. And so there was a whole transitional period that was occurring during this time in the name game. As many of the whites called it. But at the same time, you still had a solid group of people and institutions in this country that had the name Africa on them. The Africa Free Schools, the various types of African churches, and African Benevolent Society, the African Masons,
Methodist Episcopal.
Right. We could go on and on, and that's a reflection of the desire to keep us in contact with the notion of Africa. And so as this is happening, you're finding people who are writing, and especially those who are going to school and studying classical education. In classical education, you had people like William Scarborough, who was part of what I call the Wilberforce group, with him and William Wells Brown and Dr. James McCune Smith. Dr. James McCune Smith had to go all the way to the University of Edinburgh to get his MD, because they wouldn't give him one here. And so here you got William Scarborough, who's one of the premier classicists of his day. Because back in those days, when you went to school, if you got higher education, then you studied the Homer and Plato and Aristotle and all these people in the Greek. So that, like, if people read books from the early periods of the United States, sometimes the books will have passages in Greek at the turn of the century, right? The turn of the 19th century to the 20th century in Greek, but they're not explained. Because people understood that. That's what they studied. All right, so they didn't have to have an explanation. If you were educated, you knew what that passage meant, or in Greek or in Latin. All right, so what we need to do is, my thing is, as Dr. Carruthers used to make the case, that we should be grounded in the classical academy. Now, there are those who argue against us and say, see, when you use the word classical, you're talking about Greece. No, we're not. You know, I could use another term in another language, but you wouldn't understand what I was saying. So we're using something that everybody can understand. All right? And when we talk about classical, we talk about something that was good way back then, and it's still good now. All right, and so when we talk about being grounded in the classical academy, they'll say, okay, we're using the academy. Plato thought up the academy. Okay, well, Plato studied in Egypt. We know this. You know, Diogenes Laertius in the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, he talks about, Plato himself acknowledges that, you know, he went to Egypt to study. You know, so that's not unusual. You know, Pythagoras wasn't the father of geometry. Thales says that Thales went to Egypt and he was from Miletus in Asia Minor. He said, Thales went to Egypt and I studied geometry and brought it back to Greece, long before Pythagoras was even born. So, you know, along with, you know, intellectual warfare is more than just clearing up these things about these aspects of here. We got to clear it all up. We got to just expose all of the fallacies and correct them, because it's not like they're not known. And you got lots of whites out there. You got, you know, you got battles going on even amongst them, because for your audience, you see, back in I think it was 1995, 1986, 87, something like that. Newsweek did an article, did a whole front page spread on Afrocentrism. Subtitle was Cleopatra Black. It was at that moment that academia in the United States, traditional academia in the United States, it dawned on them that there's some black people out here talking like this. Well, we've been talking like this since the 19th century. But all of a sudden now it's of interest, because now this is being challenged in the academy. Students are going into history class and saying, you know, the Egyptians were black, you know. And the teacher's like, well, that's not true. And they're saying, well, look at these pictures. And they'll say, well, those are not black people. And then we had to make the case with them, well, that's because this is not what you define as black, but by your terms of definition for black, this is black. But, you know, I did an experiment once in my class. I lined up different black people in my class, and I asked my class, which was a very mixed class, is that the kind of black you're talking about, or that the kind of black, or that the kind of black, or that the kind of black? What kind of black are you talking about? And they had never thought of it like that. Or one of my favorite examples is that I take the white piece of paper and put it up next to a white student's face and say, this is white. Mm-hmm. Do you look like that? Oh, so we are all people of color. Mm-hmm. How about that? Then we can get into some other things, you know what I mean? But we have to know it like that in order to engage in intellectual warfare. We got to be able to understand why it was that our situation is like it is in this country. Why it was that when African Americans were taken out of chattel slavery, they had all the skills. They were the skilled laborers. You know, my first ancestor who came to this country was a blacksmith. I tell people, what do you think blacksmith meant? They were black men who worked in smithing, worked in iron. That's what he did. We were the carpenters. We were the plumbers. If it was work to be done, we did it, because work was not something that white people did. I tell you, if you read Frederick Douglass's article on what to the Negro was meant the 4th of July, mm-hmm. at the end of it, he lists all of these trades mm-hmm. that we did. Okay, what happened? Well, there was fear of competition. And so what northern business people did was they kind of brought immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe to come in and had them do that work. They were the cheap labor at the time, because they were afraid of competition, because they knew that those black people were serious about getting some work done and that they were going to do some work. But as long as they were a free labor pool, under forced labor, and some people got paid on occasions. There were some who did get paid. I'm not saying everybody was free labor, but some did get paid, but by comparison it was free labor. All of a sudden now, you got all this free, all these people with all these skills out here now that can't work. There's a good story about General Samuel Chapman Armstrong. General Samuel Chapman Armstrong founded the Hampton Normal Model, right, of schools, right? He was the teacher of Booker T. Washington. And there's a story of how he went to the blacks who were the scholars at the school were supposed to get special awards and everything, and he didn't allow them to go to the award ceremony. He only let the whites go to the award ceremony and get the awards. He gave them little primers. And so one of the guys who was supposed to be one of the scholars getting an award got with one of his friends who was going to be one of the servants at the dinner, and invited and dressed up as one of the workers, right? and showed up. And when Samuel Chapman Armstrong sees him, he was like, you know, you should be one of the people here at this thing. And his response to him was, yeah, well, how come you didn't invite me? Since I'm supposed to be here. But there were no blacks there from that. And so there's always been this issue. I mean, there are examples of people who wrote back then who said, look, I'm going to school, I'm doing all this, I'm learning all this stuff, and when I get out here, I know I won't be able to get a job. Well, this was in the 19th century. And we're hearing the same thing from our children in the 20th and 21st century. Mm-hmm. The same story. Mm-hmm. Well, that again brings me back to why this kind of work in intellectual warfare is important, because what we need are people who first have to believe that our children can learn this and that this will be good for them. You know, the whole idea that, well, when you're teaching your children this is feel-good history for them and making them feel good. Well, hell, you mean tell me that white kids learning about what Dr. Francis Cress Welsing calls the fondling fathers don't make them feel good? When they learn about, the lie about George Washington chopping down a cherry tree but never finding out that George Washington had a black son? Or about Thomas Jefferson. Of course, they still debating did Thomas Jefferson have a relationship with Sally Hemings and so forth. Well, or was it his cousin or his brother? I don't care. That's the way it was. Francis Scott Keyes, the famous Francis Scott Keyes, who wrote the Star Spangled Banner, was a slave owner. But who says that? And talks about these types of things. And how did he treat these people who consider his property? There. And if we're not careful and we're not conscious of what's going on right now, the same thing is about to happen. Very gradually.
The same thing is about to happen.
What I mean by that is that there's a movement slowly of pulling back all of the meager
you better not say gains.
The meager gains that we acquired, in what they call the civil rights movement. They're being kicked back. And because they're about to put, Brown up for reconsideration. Voting rights is up for reconsideration. And so the whole movement that's occurring in this country is to take that. Now, when they put it back to where we can't vote, then we can't go to school, and we can't get a job, so we can't survive. And then they're saying, well, we
can't use you.
We can't use you anymore, right? Again. Now, what's going to happen? Do we now find ourselves in a situation of being placed in, they're already applying what Dr. Bobby Wright called menticide to us, right? The destruction of our minds. Now, are they going to apply another form of genocide to us, which is already being done in very, very subtle ways? Not only in terms of our living situation, but how we're eating. And it's insane that we have childhood diabetes. That's insane. And all these other types of illnesses that they're encountering. And then in places where the Affordable Care Act would be necessary, that they call Obamacare, which is just another code word. In the states where they would be required to have this, like in Louisiana and Mississippi and so forth, they're saying, we don't want that money, which is going to pay for 100% of the health care of all these people. And that's just another way of saying, let them die. Let them die. And so there's a whole lot, when we talk about intellectual warfare, we're talking about a huge thing, but first we got to have the intellect to understand that it is a war. And it is a war for our very survivals. It's a war for our history. It's a war for our minds. It's a war for, our education. All of that is there. People. One of the things that a lot of people depend on is that we get comfortable, that we get complacent, that this has happened before. This is why it's important that we study our history, even here in the United States. that there was a movement to say, okay, we'll give them they could vote now. They can live where they want. That don't mean we got to let them live there. They can have the right to vote. Don't mean we're gonna allow them to vote.
Or give them anything to vote for.
Or if we give them anything to vote for, right? So we can allow them to have education, but we're gonna determine what type of education it's gonna be. You know, that's what the Mohawk Conference on Negro education was
Absolutely.
all about, right? That happened between June of 1890 and July of 1891, when Grover Cleveland, former president, gets together with all of these white philanthropists and Southern philanthropists. They all get together. Now, what was interesting about the Mohawk Conference at Lake Mohawk in upstate New York, what was interesting about this conference is that while there were blacks who were part of Booker T. Washington's camp who wanted to attend the meeting, the Southerners said, if they show up, we ain't coming. Mm-hmm. We're not coming. And so they told the blacks, well, you know, y'all can't come to this meeting. And they didn't. And so at the meeting, they got together and laid out their platform for the type of education they felt that blacks ought to have. And, you know, they kind of been pushing that for a long time now. It's not that we get more, but to get less. Mm-hmm. And if we can get more preachers or less teachers or people who could teach less, that's a good thing for us. And if we only give them so much information, mm-hmm. you know, in 1862, Representative Henry Berry in the Virginia Commonwealth Legislature gave a speech to the members. And one of the fundamental things that he said in his speech, and you know, anybody can look up on the internet and see it, or Henry Berry before the Virginia Commonwealth in 1862. He says to them basically that we need to cut the light off from these people, because he says, you know, essentially that if they ever discover an understanding of what has happened to them, you think people will seek freedom and not want to be free? That's a part of what happened during the American Revolution, because Thomas Paine wrote The Rights of Man. When Thomas Paine wrote The Rights of Man, which is built on the ideas from the French Revolution, and people around the United States are talking about, whites in the United States are talking about the rights of man and the rights to freedom and equality and all these things, the blacks are hearing this too. Mm-hmm. And they were like, aren't we men too? Don't we have a right to freedom and equality and justice and so forth, fraternity and all this good stuff? Don't we have that too? Yeah, but you're not men. You see, you're not men. When we say men, we mean white men, not you. You're not men. And so now we get a problem, because now we think that we're on the precipice of getting something done, and they come and tell us, well, you're not men. You know, it's like when they use the statement for the president that he's an alien. You know, aliens come from outer space. Mm-hmm. They're not of this world, mm-hmm. you know? And if they say that that man is an alien and that man is not a citizen, what they're saying by extension is that none of us who are descendants of Africans in the United States are citizens. And that's a very powerful thing too, in terms of the nature of citizenship and who is a citizen. Because in 1790, they passed what they call the Naturalization Act. The Naturalization Act stated that only whites could be classified as natural citizens of the United States. Right on the heels of that, we find Hector St. John de Crevecoeur writing, about 9 years later, writing Notes to an American Farmer, when he raises the question, well, what is an American? He says, you know, these wonderful people that came to these shores. He said, well, he's a European or the descendant of a European. Mm-hmm. All right, he lays all this out. Mm-hmm. And so in everything that happened after that, there was this clear description of what, an American is, what a citizen is, and all these types of things. And we're still fighting a battle. You know, my argument is that, you know, freedom is being free of the need to be free. If we were free, we wouldn't need to fight for freedom, because we'd already be free. Mm-hmm. So since we're not, we still got to fight that case, and we got to fight that case on a lot of fronts. And one of the fundamental fronts we got to fight it on is the intellectual front. Mm-hmm. So we need people who have knowledge, who have skills, who have the requisite education mm-hmm. to be able to engage in this battle. We need them to know everything. See, my position is don't know something, know everything.
Pluridisciplinary.
Pluridisciplinary. Very important. So that we need people who have skills, on several fronts. We used to, that's what they call multitasking today. Well, we'd always done that. Now I can't fix stuff. Don't ask me to fix your car. I can't do that. But if you bring some strange text up and say, well, Professor Ben Levi, what is this? I might be able to tell you what it is. I might be able to tell you what it says too.
Mm-hmm.
Like I see all the people walking around with all these tattoos and stuff on them. I had a true story. I had one of my students, she had something written on her neck in Japanese. I had a student down at the Center for Fantasy Studies from Japan. And I brought her over and I said, can you tell her what she, because I can't read Japanese, but can you tell her what she said had got on her neck? And I asked her, what does that, she said, it's supposed to be my name. It had nothing to do with her name. I'm not going to tell you what it said, but it wasn't good. And she was like, oh, how do I get this off of my neck? And we got people out there doing that, having no clue because they think it looks cool, without any idea of what it is. They just see it up on the wall and said, I want that. That looks cool.
We ought to be tired of being branded.
We should be. All right. In fact, in Rhode Island, very good point, speak about it in Rhode Island. Rhode Island, very interesting history by itself. Rhode Island was the shipping capital of the United States. And while they built ships there, and many of them built by Africans, they did their business in the Caribbean. All right, a lot of business in the Caribbean. And they had many, many blacks they had brought from the Caribbean who had been trained to read and write. And they branded them with a P for privileged. And privilege means that you were special, you could read, you could write, you could function in different types of areas of life and so forth. And so they represent a certain educated branch. And among these people, we had people like Paul Cuffey, James Fortin. These were people who were millionaires of their day, all right? But there were others who were also very, very skilled, at least very literate. In fact, when you look at the history of the church in Rhode Island in particular, you find where, they were sending people down to, I forget the name of Princeton before it was called Princeton, but back they were sending them down to Princeton to get degrees in theology because, a lot of people fail to realize that some of your major so-called Ivy League schools, they're all theologically based schools. They all have theological foundations because for a long time in the United States, when you went to school to get a degree, you went to school to get a degree in theology. It wasn't until later on that they started making the changes in doing that.
Liberal arts.
In liberal arts, right. Now, at the same time that when we come up to the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century, roughly between 1895 and say 1958, we begin to have the curriculum movement. All right, people beginning to ask, people like Herbert Spencer, the father of social Darwinism, begin to ask the question: what knowledge is of most worth? That is, what knowledge is most worth knowing? And it was agreed upon that the knowledge that is most worth knowing is the knowledge of Western civilization. Now, as the father of social Darwinism, of course, he also believed in social efficiency, that there was a way that people ought to learn and they had a direction that they should learn it in. Now, among these people was a man by the name of Grover Stanley Hall, G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall was also one of the people who was one of the fathers of the curriculum movement in the United States. And he was very, very concerned about these group of people that he called the multitude of the undesirables, i.e. black people and immigrants too, because they weren't supposed to be capable of being educated. And then you have people like Davenport, who was a part of the curriculum movement, who was also a eugenicist. Now we get him, you get people like John Dewey, but he's on the fringes. He's on the fringes of the curriculum movement. Very important here in Chicago in terms of the University of Chicago and the whole idea of curriculum. He was the founder of the lab school at the University of Chicago. But you have a whole lot of other people, Lester Ward, Robert Park. All these people who are part of the Chicago School of Sociology are also instrumental in the development of the curriculum movement. And all of these people, in one form or another, are also eugenicists. Because at the same time that the curriculum movement is developing, the eugenics movement is also developing.
Define eugenics for the audience.
Okay. Eugenics comes from the Greek words eu, meaning one, and genos, meaning gene, one gene. The whole idea of eugenics was the creation of a pure, unadulterated group of people. This group of people are referred to as the nativists. These are people who are descendants of the Anglo-Saxons, or perceive themselves to be descendants of the Anglo-Saxons. And their whole objective was to make sure that they remain pure, not only from blacks, but from the European immigrants who came in, because the European immigrants who came into this country from Southern and Eastern Europe, including the Irish, were not considered clean. They were considered filthy. And in fact, you can see in the development of curriculum that from the time that the curriculum is being in development, there's a whole classical curriculum that was established before the turn of the century. And at the turn of the century, now we see one of the top things at the top of the list that one learns when they go to school is health. In fact, back in those days, and I'm sure you can remember, they used to have little films that they would show people about this is how you ought to dress and how you ought to prepare for school, and look at them between this person, all of them were whites, of course, right? That should be, this is how you look when you were clean and prepared for school, and this is how you look when you're unprepared and you're not clean, and all these types of things. Well, there was a reflection too on this is what people ought to learn if you want to be considered a part of American society. Then you need to follow these particular things. So health was at the top of the list. You know, in terms of real act, and then on top of that, ultimately it got down to you learning a particular skill. Today we call that tracking, you know, because of the assumption that higher order thinking was not something that blacks and, quote, immigrants at the time could do. Lower order thinking was what they were supposed to do, so they got tracked into vocational training, as they called it. Well, once this happens and you're taken out of that realm of what they call higher order thinking, you can't do critical analysis. You know, you're incapable of looking at the questions of, you know, ontology, reality, the nature of reality. You don't have to worry about the questions of knowing, you know what I mean, epistemology. You don't have to do any of that stuff, because what we're going to do is teach you how to build stuff. Mm-hmm. You don't have to think.
How to work.
How to work. You don't have to learn how to do that. And
not how to think.
Not how to think, all right? Because you don't think. You don't know how to think. You're incapable of thinking because you're an animal.
We
and
don't
you're
need
savage.
you to think.
We don't need you to think. You just do what we tell you to do, right? And on top of this, you got the fact that here these immigrants come in, and you might say, well, what does that have to do with intellectual warfare? Everything, because you need to know all these people. Oh boy, it's almost that time, huh? Wow, time flies, man. Well, I can say this right quick, that those immigrants who first came to this country were not considered to be whites. In fact, they were thought of as blacks. They became whites later on when they started forming unions, and the Anglo-Saxons realized their power as a political base.
Well, you know, you have hypnotized me, but I am a very good listener, so
Yes,
I have
ma'am.
missed the thing that you said. I was just wondering why teachers don't consider the content of the curriculum. They fight over the longest school day, they fight over the salary, but not the